the history of the oppression of the majority by a small number of men, to see that all the advantages the rich have over the poor are based on nothing but flogging, imprisonment, and murder. One need but reflect on the unceasing, persistent struggle of all to better their material position, which is the guiding motive of men of the present day, to be convinced that the advantages of the rich over the poor could never and can never be maintained by anything but force. There may be cases of oppression, of violence, and of punishments, though they are rare, the aim of which is not to secure the privileges of the propertied class. But one may confidently assert that in any society where for every man living in ease there are 10 exhausted by labor, envious, covetous, and often suffering with their families from direct privation, all the privileges of the rich, all their luxuries and superfluities, are obtained and maintained only by torturers, imprisonment, and murder. The train I met on the 9th of September, going with soldiers, guns, cartridges, and rods, to confirm the rich landowner in the possession of a small forest which he had taken from the starving peasants, which they were in the direst need of, and he was in no need of at all, was a striking proof of how men are capable of doing deeds directly opposed to their principles and their conscience without perceiving it. The special train consisted of one first-class carriage for the governor, the officials, and the officers, and several luggage vans crammed full of soldiers. The latter, smart young fellows in their clean new uniforms, were standing about in groups or sitting swinging their legs in the wide-open doorways of the luggage vans. Some were smoking, nudging each other, joking, grinning, and laughing. Others were munching sunflower seeds and spitting out the husks with dignity. Some of them ran along the platform to drink some water from a tub there, and when they met the officers they slackened their pace, made their stupid gesture of salutation, raising their hands to their heads with serious faces as though they were doing something of the greatest importance. They kept their eyes on them till they had passed by them, and then set off running still more merrily, stamping their heels on the platform, laughing and chattering after the manner of healthy, good-natured young fellows traveling in lively company. They were going to assist at the murder of their fathers or grandfathers, just as if they were going on a party of pleasure, or at any rate on some quiet, ordinary business. The same impression was produced by the well-dressed functionaries and officers who were scattered about the platform and in the first-class carriage. At a table covered with bottles was sitting the governor, who was responsible for the whole expedition, dressed in his half-military uniform and eating something while he chatted tranquilly about the weather with some acquaintances he had met, as though the business he was upon was of so simple and ordinary a character that it could not disturb his serenity and his interest in the change of weather. At a little distance from the table sat the general of the police. He was not taking any refreshment and had an impenetrable bored expression, as though he were weary of the formalities to be gone through. On all sides officers were bustling noisily about in their red uniforms trimmed with gold. One sat at a table finishing his bottle of beer. Another stood at the buffet eating a cake and brushing the crumbs off his uniform, threw down his money with a self-confident air. Another was sauntering before the carriages of our train, staring at the faces of the women. All these men who were going to murder or to torture the famishing and defenseless creatures who provide them their sustenance had the air of men who knew very well that they were doing their duty, and some were even proud, were glorying in what they were doing. What is the meaning of it? All these people are within a half an hour of reaching a place where, in order to provide a wealthy young man with 3,000 rubles stolen from a whole community of famishing peasants, they may be forced to commit the most horrible acts one can conceive, to murder or torture, as was done in Orel, innocent beings, their brothers. And they see the place and time approaching with untroubled serenity. To say that all these government officials, officers, and soldiers do not know what is before them is impossible, for they are prepared for it. The governor must have given directions about the rods, the officials must have sent an order for them, purchased them, and entered the item in their accounts. The military officers have given and received orders about cartridges. They all know what they are going to torture, perhaps to kill, their famishing fellow creatures, and that they must set to work within an hour. To say, as is usually said, and as they would themselves repeat, that they are acting from conviction of the necessity for supporting the state organization would be a mistake, for in the first place, these men have probably never even thought about state organization and the necessity of it. In the second place, they cannot possibly be convinced that the act in which they are taking part will tend to support rather than to ruin the state. And thirdly, in reality, the majority, if not all, of these men, far from ever sacrificing their own pleasure or tranquility to support the state, never let slip an opportunity of profiting at the expense of the state in every way they can increase their own pleasure and ease, so that they are not acting thus for the sake of the abstract principle of the state. What is the meaning of it? Yet I know all these men. If I don't know all of them personally, I know their characters pretty nearly, their past and their way of thinking. They certainly all have mothers, some of them wives and children. They are certainly, for the most part, good, kind, even tender-hearted fellows, who hate every sort of cruelty, not to speak of murder. Many of them would not kill or hurt an animal. Moreover, they are all professed Christians, and regard all violence directed against the defenseless as base and disgraceful. Certainly not one of them would be capable of everyday life, for his own personal profit, of doing 100th part of what the governor of Oriel did. Every one of them would be insulted at the supposition that he was capable of doing anything of the kind in private life, and yet they are within a half an hour of reaching the place where they may be reduced to the inevitable necessity of committing this crime. What is the meaning of it? But it is not only these men who are going to train prepared for murder and torture. How could the men who began the whole business, the landowner, the commissioner, the judges, and those who gave the order and are responsible for it, the ministers, the Tsar, who are also good men, professed Christians, how could they elaborate such a plan and assent to it, knowing its consequences? The spectators even, who took no part in the affair, how could they, who are indignant at the sight of any cruelty in private life, even the overtaxing of a horse, allow such a horrible deed to be perpetrated? How was it they did not rise in indignation and bar the roads, shouting, "No! Flog and kill starving men because they won't let their last possession be stolen from them without resistance. That we won't allow." But far from anyone doing this, the majority, even of those who were the cause of the affair, such as the commissioner, the landowner, the judge, and those who took part in it and arranged it, as the governor, the ministers, and the Tsar, are perfectly tranquil, and do not even feel a prick of conscience. And apparently all the men who are going to carry out this crime are equally undisturbed. The spectators, who one would suppose could have no personal interest in the affair, looked rather with sympathy than with disapproval at all these people preparing to carry out this infamous action. In the same compartment with me was a wood merchant who had risen from a peasant. He openly expressed aloud his sympathy with such punishments. "They can't disobey the authorities," he said. "That's what the authorities are for. Let them have a lesson. Send their fleas flying. They'll give over making commotions, I warrant you. That's what they want." What is the meaning of it? It is not possible to say that all these people who have provoked or aided or allowed this deed are such worthless creatures that Knowing all the infamy of what they are doing, they do it against their principles. Some for pay and for profit, others through fear of punishment. All of them in certain circumstances know how to stand up for their principles. Not one of these officials will curse, read another man's letter, or put up with an affront without demanding satisfaction. Not one of these officers would consent to cheat at cards, would refuse to pay a debt of honor, would betray a comrade, run away on a field of battle, or desert the flag. Not one of these soldiers would spit out the Holy Sacrament or eat meat on Good Friday. All these men are ready to face any kind of privation, suffering, or danger rather than consent to do what they regard as wrong. They have therefore the strength to resist doing what is against their principles. It is even less possible to assert that all these men are such brutes that it is natural and not distasteful to them to do such deeds. One need only talk to those people a little to see that all of them, the landowner even, and the judge, and the minister, and the czar, and the government, the officers and the soldiers, not only disapprove of such things in the depth of their soul, but suffer from the consciousness of their participation in them when they recollect what they imply. But they try not to think about it. One need only talk to any of these who are taking part in the affair, from the landowner to the lowest policeman or soldier, to see that in the depths of their soul they all know it is a wicked thing, that it would be better to have nothing to do with it, and are suffering from the knowledge. A lady of liberal views, who was traveling in the same train with us, seeing the governor and the officers in the first-class saloon, and learning the object of the expedition, began intentionally raising her voice so that they should hear, to abuse the existing order of things, and to cry shame on men who would take part in such proceedings. Everyone felt awkward. No one knew where to look, but no one contradicted her. They tried to look as though such remarks were not worth answering, but one could see by their faces and their averted eyes that they were ashamed. I noticed the same thing in the soldiers. They too knew that what they were sent to do was a shameful thing, but they did not want to think about what was before them. When the wood merchant, as I suspect insincerely only to show that he was a man of education, began to speak of the necessity of such measures, the soldiers who heard him all turned away from him, scowling and pretending not to hear. All the men who, like the landowner, the commissioner, the minister, and the czar, were responsible for the perpetration of this act, as well as those who were now going to execute it, and even those who were mere spectators of it, knew that it was a wickedness, and were ashamed of taking any share in it, and even of being present at it. Then why did they do it, or allow it to be done? Ask them the question. And the landowner who started the affair, and the judge who pronounced a clearly unjust, even though formally legal, decision, and those who commanded the execution of the decision, and those who, like the policemen, soldiers, and peasants, will execute the deed with their own hands, flogging and killing their brothers, all who have devised, abetted, decreed, executed, or allowed such crimes, will make substantially the same reply. The authorities, those who have started, devised, and decreed the matter, will say that such acts are necessary for the maintenance of the existing order. The maintenance of the existing order is necessary for the welfare of the country and of humanity, for the possibility of social existence and human progress. Men of the poorer classes, peasants and soldiers, who will have to execute the deed of violence with their own hands, say that they do so because it is the command of their superior authority, and the superior authority knows what he is about. That those are in authority who ought to be in authority, and that they know what they are doing, appears to them a truth of which there can be no doubt. If they could admit the possibility of mistake or error, it would only be of functionaries of a lower grade. The highest authority, on which all the rest depends, seemed to them immaculate beyond suspicion. Though expressing the motives of their conduct differently, both those in command and their subordinates are agreed in saying that they act thus because the existing order is the order which must and ought to exist at the present time, and that therefore to support it is the sacred duty of every man. Only this acceptance of the necessity, and therefore immutability, of the existing order, all who take part in acts of violence on the part of the government base the argument always advanced in their justification. Since the existing order is immutable, they say, the refusal of a single individual to perform the duties laid upon him will effect no change in things, and will only mean that some other man will be put in his place who may do the work worse, that is to say, more cruelly, to the still greater injury of the victims of the act of violence. This conviction that the existing order is the necessary and therefore immutable order, which it is a sacred duty for every man to support, enables good men of high principles in private life to take part with conscience, more or less untroubled, in crimes such as that perpetrated in Orel, and that which the men in the Tula train were going to perpetrate. But what is this conviction based on? It is easy to understand that the landowner prefers to believe that the existing order is inevitable and immutable, because this existing order secures him an income from his hundreds and thousands of acres, by means of which he can lead his habitual, indolent, and luxurious life. It is easy to understand that the judge readily believes in the necessity of an order of things, through which he receives a wage 50 times as great as the most industrious laborer can earn. And the same applies to all the higher officials. It is only under the existing regime that as governor, prosecutor, senator, members of the various councils, they can receive their several thousands of rubles a year, without which they and their families would once sink into ruin. Since if it were not for the position they occupy, they would never, by their own abilities, industry, or acquirements, get 1,000th part of their salaries. The minister, the czar, and all the higher authorities are in the same position. The only distinction is that the higher and the more exceptional their position, the more necessity it is for them to believe that the existing order is the only possible order of things. For without it they would not only be unable to gain an equal position, but would be found to fall lower than all other people. A man who has of his own free will entered the police force at a wage of 10 rubles, which he could easily earn in any other position, is hardly dependent on the preservation of the existing regime, and so he may not believe in its immutability. But a king or an emperor who receives millions for his post, and knows that there are thousands of people around him who would like to dethrone him and take his place, who knows that he will never receive such a revenue or so much honor in any other position, who knows in most cases through his more or less despotic rule that if he were dethroned he would have to answer to abuse of power, he cannot but believe in the necessity and even sacredness of the existing order. The higher and the more profitable a man's position, the more unstable it becomes, and the more terrible and dangerous a fall from it for him. The more firmly the man believes in the existing order, and therefore with the more ease of conscience can such a man perpetrate cruel and wicked acts, as though they were not in his own interest, but for the maintenance of that order. This is the case with all men in authority who occupy positions more profitable than they could occupy except for the present regime, from the lowest police officer to the czar. All of them are more or less convinced that the existing order is immutable, because the chief consideration it is to their own advantage. But the peasants, the soldiers who are at the bottom of the social scale, who have no kind of advantage from the existing order, who are in the very lowest position of subjugation and humiliation, what forces them to believe that the existing order in which they are in their humble and disadvantageous position is the order which ought to exist, and which they ought to support even at the cost of evil actions contrary to their conscience? What forces these men to the false reasoning that the existing order is unchanging and that therefore they ought to support it, when it is so obvious, on the contrary, that it is only unchanging because they themselves support it. What forces these peasants, taken only yesterday from the plow and dressed in ugly and unseemly costumes with blue collars and gilt buttons, to go with guns and sabers and murder their famishing fathers and brothers? They gain advantage and can be in no fear of losing the position they occupy because it is worse than that from which they have been taken. The persons in authority of the higher orders, landowners, merchants, judges, senators, governors, ministers, czars, and officers, take part in such doings because the existing order is to their advantage. In other respects they are often good and kind-hearted men, and they are more able to take part in such doings because their share in them is limited to suggestions, decisions, and orders. These persons in authority never do themselves what they suggest, decide, or command to be done. For the most part, they do not even see how all the atrocious deeds they have suggested and authorized are carried out. But the unfortunate men of the lower orders, who gain no kind of advantage from the existing regime, but, on the contrary, are treated with the utmost contempt, support it, even by dragging people with their own hands from their families, handcuffing them, throwing them in prison, guarding them, shooting them. Why do they do it? What forces them to believe that the existing order is unchanging and they must support it? All violence rests, we know, on those who do the beating, the handcuffing, the imprisoning, and the killing with their own hands. If there were no soldiers or armed policemen ready to kill or outrage anyone as they are ordered, not one of those people who sign sentences of death, imprisonment, or galley slavery for life would make up his mind to hang in prison or torture 1,000th part of those whom, quietly sitting in his study, he now orders to be tortured in all kinds of ways, simply because he does not see it nor do it himself, but only gets it done at a distance by these servile tools. All the acts of injustice and cruelty which are committed in the ordinary course of daily life have only become habitual because there are these men always ready to carry out such acts of injustice and cruelty. If it were not for them, far from anyone using violence against the immense masses who are now ill-treated, those who now command their punishment would not venture to sentence them, would not even dare to dream of the sentences they decree with such easy confidence at present. And if it were not for these men, ready to kill or torture anyone at their commander's will, no one would dare to claim, as all the idle landowners claim with such assurance, that a piece of land surrounded by peasants who are in wretchedness from want of land is the property of a man who does not cultivate it, or that stores of corn taken by swindling from the peasants ought to remain untouched in the midst of a population dying of hunger because the merchants must make their profit. If it were not for these servile instruments at the disposal of the authorities, it could never have entered the head of the landowner to rob the peasants of the forest they had tended, nor of the officials to think they are entitled to their salaries taken from the famishing people, the price of their oppression. Least of all could anyone dream of killing or exiling men for exposing falsehood and telling the truth. All this can only be done because the authorities are confidently assured that they have always these servile tools at hand, ready to carry out all their demands into effect by means of torture and murder. All the deeds of violence of tyrants, from Napoleon to the lowest commander of a company who fires upon a crowd, can only be explained by the intoxicating effect of their absolute power over these slaves. All force, therefore, rests on these men who carry out the deeds of violence with their own hands, the men who serve in the police or the army, especially the army, for the police only venture to do their work because the army is at their back. What, then, has brought these masses of honest men on whom the whole thing depends, who gain nothing by it, and who have to do these atrocious deeds with their own hands? What has brought them to accept the amazing delusion that the existing order, unprofitable, ruinous, and fatal, as it is for them, is the order which ought to exist? Who has led them into this amazing delusion? They can never have persuaded themselves that they ought to do what is against their conscience, and also the source of misery and ruin for themselves and all their class, who make up 9/10 of the population. How can you kill people when it is written in God's commandment, "Thou shalt not kill"? I have often inquired of different soldiers, and I always drove them to embarrassment and confusion by reminding them of what they did not want to think about. They knew they were bound by the law of God, "Thou shalt not kill," and knew, too, that they were bound by their duty as soldiers, but had never reflected on the contradiction between these duties. The drift of the timid answers I received to this question was always approximately this: the killing in war and executing criminals by command of the government are not included in the general prohibition of murder. But when I said this distinction was not made in the law of God, and reminded them of the Christian duty of fraternity, forgiveness of injuries, and love, which could not be reconciled with murder, the peasants usually agreed, but in their turn began to ask me questions. "How does it happen," they inquired, "that the government, which, according to their ideas, cannot do wrong, sends the army to war and orders criminals to be executed?" When I answered that the government does wrong in giving such orders, the peasants fell into still greater confusion, and either broke off their conversation or else got angry with me. "They must have found a law for it. The archbishops know as much about it as we do, I should hope," a Russian soldier once observed to me, and in saying this the soldier obviously set his mind at rest, in the full conviction that his spiritual guides had found a law which authorized his ancestors and the czars and their descendants and millions of men to serve as he was doing himself, and that the question I had put him was a kind of hoax or conundrum on my part. Everyone in our Christian society knows, either by tradition or by revelation or by the voice of conscience, that murder is one of the most fearful crimes a man can commit, as the gospel tells us, and that the sin of murder cannot be limited to certain persons. That is, murder cannot be a sin for some and not a sin for others. Everyone knows that if murder is a sin, it is always a sin, whoever are the victims murdered, just like the sin of adultery, theft, or any other. At the same time, from their childhood up, men see that murder is not only permitted, but even sanctioned by the blessings of those whom they are accustomed to regard as their divinely appointed spiritual guides, and see their secular leaders with calm assurance organizing murder, proud to wear murderous arms, and demanding of others in the name of the laws of the country and even of God that they should take part in murder. Men see that there is some inconsistency here, but not being able to analyze it, involuntarily assume that this apparent inconsistency is only the result of their ignorance. The very grossness and obviousness of the inconsistency confirms them in this conviction. End of chapter 12, part 1.